Before we begin, thank you so much for being here and supporting the channel. Every like, every share, and every subscription truly means a lot to me. Your support is a huge source of encouragement, and it helps me keep bringing more stories like this to you. So if you enjoy this kind of story, please subscribe, like, and share. Now let's begin. Khepri Nine hung over the brown storm bands of the gas giant like a scar built on purpose. It was half fortress and half refugee shell, and Rhea Soren knew its corridors by the sounds they made when the filters ran low. She was Earth's senior logistics commander on the moon. Her job was not glory. It was water tables, shelter rotations, broken cargo lifts, emergency power windows, and the quiet arithmetic that decided who kept breathing when systems failed. On the day the outer blockade tightened, she stood in Civilian Water Hub 3 with a slate full of ration numbers and a line of tired parents waiting for refill stamps. She had come in person because one purifier bank had dropped below safe output, and she wanted to see the failure with her own eyes before moving more people. Her immediate goal was simple to say and brutal to carry out. She had to keep the southern shelter grid supplied long enough to move the children, the oxygen-dependent patients, and the core maintenance crews off the moon before the next pressure failure hit. The line smelled of metal dust, warm fabric, and recycled air. A little boy in a gray thermal wrap stared at the badge on her chest, as if badges still promised protection. Behind him, a grandmother held 2 water canisters and tried not to cough. Rhea checked the hub screen again and forced herself to read the numbers one more time. 42,000 civilians still remained inside the moon's shell. 2 defense batteries on the equatorial ridge had enough stored charge for only a handful of heavy discharges. Earth had 3 transport ships left that could still fly through debris and heat bloom. Every other vessel had been lost, grounded, or stripped for parts during 6 weeks of siege. The 3 that remained were not warships. The Mercy Belle had once carried medical refrigeration. Between colonies, the Clay Meridian was an old water hauler with patch shielding. The Pine Harbor had been a modular shelter tug until someone welded plating along its spine and taught it to live in a war zone. Rhea looked at the people in line and felt the old pressure settle behind her ribs. 3 ships were not a fleet. They were a promise that could still fail. The call from command arrived as a tone in her wrist unit, too clean for the room she was standing in. She stepped aside near a wall of stacked filter cartridges and accepted it. Colonel Anwin Price appeared in a narrow field from Earth Fleet Logistics Command, her expression already flattened into official restraint. The order came from the Regional Alliance Board, not from Earth alone. All Earth personnel not essential to orbital defense were to withdraw from Khepri 9 within 6 hours. All Earth flag ships were to disengage from unsanctioned runs. The phrasing was careful and polished, almost kind. The blockade was now being treated as part of a fragile containment arrangement among 3 non-human powers. Further Earth action, the order said, risked broadening the conflict. Withdrawal would support strategic de-escalation. Rhea listened without interrupting. Then she asked the only question that mattered. How many civilians are covered by an approved evacuation corridor? Colonel Price looked down once. None at present. Rhea let that answer settle. Then this is not a withdrawal, she said. This is abandonment with cleaner language. Colonel Price did not argue. She only repeated that the order was lawful, that Earth could protest later at a higher level, and that staying might cost them political leverage across the sector. Behind Rhea, someone in line dropped a canister. The metal clang echoed through the hub. She thought of the southern grid losing water pressure in 11 hours. She thought of 3,000 people in low insulation shelters near the thermal trench. She thought of children who needed powered oxygen rigs. Request denied, she said quietly. I am delaying compliance until the critical civilian list is clear. Colonel Price closed her eyes for half a second. Rhea, that is not a request you can grant yourself. Watch me keep them alive anyway, Rhea said, and cut the channel. She did not announce defiance. She did not gather officers and make a speech. She went back to work. In Command Transit Bay 4, under lights that flickered every few seconds to save power, she spread her staff around a cargo table and rebuilt the moon's circulation map from scratch. Civilian zones became rings of survival on the surface in front of her. Water, air, triage, shelter, lift shafts, docking points. The three ships were reassigned into what she called a living corridor. It was not just a transport plan. It was a moving survival line. The clay meridian would run water bladders, portable filters, and thermal blankets into the southern grid, then return with families from the outer shelters. The Mercy Bell would carry blood coolers, power cells for breathing units, and critical patients. The Pine Harbor would tow modular shelters and broken lift cages, then load children and maintenance crews on the outbound leg. Rhea authorized shield patching with salvage alloy meant for gun housings. She rerouted battery support from a ceremonial hall that had not hosted a delegation in months. She stripped decorative lighting from the Eastern Concourse to feed one more hour to Shelter Ring 5. None of it looked heroic. Every choice looked like theft from some other future need. But logistics in a siege was the art of deciding what could be stolen from tomorrow, so people could survive today. Dr. Hannah Bell met her outside the emergency ward with 3 printed lists because half the ward tablets were dead again. Hannah was the Moon's lead emergency physician, compact, sharp-eyed, and too tired to pretend otherwise. If you force me to choose between the oxygen children and the radiation burn cases, I will resign in person and haunt you after that, Hannah said. Rhea took the lists. Good. I need stubborn people. Together they cut through the categories. The first lift would take 12 incubator infants, 19 children on assisted breathing, 41 adults who would not survive another power interruption, and 8 technicians from the thermal exchange plant. The technicians mattered because if the plant lost control, half the Moon would freeze in some corridors and cook in others. Captain Evo Mercer from the Clay Meridian came in still wearing flight gloves. He was the veteran pilot of the water hauler, older than his ship by 2 rebuild cycles, and he had a face that always looked 1 second away from a dry joke. I can run the trench route if Ridge 2 covers my turn, Evo said. If that battery misses, my ship becomes weather. Rhea nodded. Then it does not miss. Around them, staff moved as if speed alone might change the scale of the problem. It cannot, but speed could decide which names remained on the list after each hour. The first convoy launched through particulate haze that had once been mining waste and was now just another hazard in the air above the Moon. Rhea watched from the flight control gallery, hearing each call through the patch tactical net. Pine Harbor clear. Mercy Bell clear. Clay Meridian clear by 6 seconds and taking abrasion along port flank. The defense battery on Ridge 2 fired once, a white arc beyond the viewport. It was enough to blind 1 sensor cluster in the blockade line, and by the transports a sliver of corridor. For 9 minutes it worked. Then a picket craft from the outer ring came too close, and someone out there decided Earth's restraint had become inconvenient. A burst of fire chewed through one of Pine Harbor's external cargo braces. It was not a kill shot. It was not even a serious military strike, but it tore loose 2 shelter modules and spun debris into the lane. Rhea felt the room pull tight. Evo's voice came over the net, raw but steady. I have visual. I can nudge harbor clear if I dump water mass. That meant throwing away life support for 1 whole shelter cluster. Rhea saw the cost before he finished the sentence. Do it, she said. Get the patients through. The Clay Meridian opened relief vents and dumped half a run's worth of treated water into space as reaction mass. Pine Harbor swung free. The convoy completed the inbound leg and came home carrying more than 300 civilians. It should have felt like relief. Instead, less than an hour later, the feeds lit up with edited footage of Earth transports flying under partial shield cover near a military battery. The rescue had become a story, and someone else was already trying to own it. The language spread fast and clean. Earth accused of using humanitarian cover to extend conflict. Earth convoy challenges lawful containment. Earth nationalism escalates siege. Rhea stared at the screen until Hannah shut it off with her palm. That was the next battlefield. The ships had survived the lane, but the rescue was now being attacked with images, captions, and cleaned up language. By the next cycle, Khepri 9 had become 2 places at once. There was the real Moon, where people carried canisters, slept in shifts, and waited near loading doors with numbered blankets around their shoulders. Then there was the moon in the feeds, where clean-voice commentators discussed proportionality over moving maps and polished graphics. Rhea lived in the first place and had to fight the second. She spent one whole transit stretch rebuilding trust inside the shelters, because rumors could kill as quickly as broken pumps. Some said Earth had already signed a leave. Some said the blockade would vent outer shelters if people resisted loading order. Some said only Earth nationals would be taken. Rhea moved from bay to bay with a portable speaker and told the same plain truth again and again. No one is being sorted by flag. The first list is medical need, children, essential plant crews, then family units nearest failure zones. If you see an Earth badge cutting the line for politics, report it to me. People listened because she used concrete language. They did not need hope as much as they needed a pattern they could understand. In Shelter Ring 5, a mechanic with grease-black hands asked if Earth was really staying. Rhea looked at the man's 2 daughters wrapped in one blanket and answered honestly, "Earth is staying as long as I can still move a ship." The man nodded once, not grateful, just anchored. That was enough. That same day, Rhea walked the loading queue in Dock Hall 2 because she had learned that people trusted an officer who showed up before. A rumor finished spreading. Families sat on cargo mats with all they had decided was worth carrying. A woman in refinery blue asked if Earth citizens would be moved first once the real panic started. No, Rhea said. The answer traveled faster than any speech. A teenage boy from an independent freight clan frowned at her. That is politically stupid. Probably, Rhea said. But air failure does not care who voted for whom. She repeated the rule until it became almost boring. Medical need first. Children who could not survive another outage next. Then critical plant crews. Then the people living closest to the next likely system failure. By the time she reached the end of the line, a few shoulders had dropped. Not because the situation was better, but because the rule was understandable. She knew then that clarity itself was a form of shelter. In a siege, confusion stole strength before any shot did. On the third day after the order, Admiral Sarek Valeth finally put his own face on the crisis. The transmission came broad spectrum, public enough that half the moon heard it rebroadcast within minutes. Sarek's species had the long jaw and narrow eyes of desert predators, but it was his voice people remembered. Calm, educated, patient. He appeared against a command bridge full of muted light and drifting tactical glyphs. "Commander Rhea Soren of Earth," Sarek said, pronouncing her name with deliberate care. "You have converted civilian transport assets into instruments of contested movement within an active containment zone. Withdraw and preserve wider peace, or remain and accept responsibility for all losses that follow." Rhea accepted the link from operations. There are still civilians inside the zone. There are always civilians inside zones created by larger failures, Sarek said. The purpose of leadership is to limit the total field of ruin. He spoke as if he were explaining weather. He did not threaten slaughter. He threatened arithmetic. A smaller loss now, a larger peace later. That was the doctrine wrapped around everything. Rhea found that it angered her more than open cruelty would have. "You are asking me to call dead children stability." "I am. Asking you not to mistake local pain for the center of the map," Sarek answered. Then the transmission ended, and his words went everywhere. The feeds loved him. He sounded reasonable. That was the danger. Pressure also arrived from Earth in forms more insulting than fear. 2 civilian ministers on the home networks began hinting that local officers were complicating diplomacy for emotional reasons. One even called Khepri 9 a tragic but peripheral node during a budget interview. Tomas Vale, Rhea's operations analyst and records lead, played the clip only once before shutting it off in disgust. Rhea did not allow herself the luxury of outrage. She simply made a note of the phrase and added it to the growing list of words powerful people used when they wanted distance from the consequences of their own arrangements. Colonel Price called again after the clip spread and spoke more softly than before. Earth had not abandoned Khepri 9 in public, but some in government were already preparing to survive the story if she failed. "If this breaks wrong," Colonel Price said. They will say you exceeded humanitarian necessity. Rhea looked through the operations glass at 3 deck crews lifting water bladders by hand because the cargo rails had jammed again. Then they can try explaining necessity to the people carrying the bladders. Colonel Price did not respond. She only sent 1 extra package of encrypted storage keys with no official note attached. Even inside wavering systems, individuals still made choices. Later, in a maintenance corridor where heat pipes ran behind the walls and made the metal pulse faintly underfoot, Liaison Torin Issad asked to speak off the record. Torin represented the Alliance's Civilian Coordination Office, though no one on Khepri 9 had seen much coordination from his people for weeks. Rhea had worked with him before the siege tightened. He had helped clear customs codes, redirect food pallets, and move dispute paperwork out of the way. He had once been useful. Now he stood with his hands folded and looked over his shoulder before he spoke. You are being watched above your rank, Torin said. That alone tells me something went wrong far above mine. Rhea waited. Reduce the visible runs. Stop sending footage. Stop painting Earth across the hulls. Get your people out while you still can. There are negotiations underway that this moon cannot be allowed to complicate. Rhea felt the floor turn colder. Cannot be allowed by whom? Torin's jaw flexed. I do not have names I can prove. I have tone. I have timing. I have doors that stopped opening the same day your rescue status requests stopped being acknowledged. So you came here to save my career after the dead are properly categorized? He flinched, not because she was unfair, but because she was close enough. I came because once this goes up to the council level, the story will not belong to the people who lived it. He left without another word. Rhea stood alone and understood something new. The moon was not only being strangled from outside. It was already being translated into a more convenient shape somewhere above her. Torin was not the only one who tried to bend her away from the line she had chosen. An Earth diplomatic attaché named Selmero arrived by secure relay, face polished and tired, asking her to consider partial symbolic compliance. Withdraw 1 ship. Change Earth markings on the hulls. Stop using the Ridge battery in visible coordination with transport launches. Give them something they can call moderation, Mero said. Rhea understood the logic. Optics made room for survival in rooms she had never entered. But she also understood what would happen on the moon if she started flying for optics instead of throughput. Moderation for whom? She asked. The chamber or the people waiting at the loading gates? Mero said nothing for a long time. Then he admitted the council block was already preparing language that would isolate her as a local overreach if the matter rose higher. They will say Earth did not ask for this. Earth may say what it likes later, Rhea answered. I'm busy with what Earth is doing now. The attaché closed the channel, looking almost relieved. Institutions often preferred disobedience to clarity because clarity stuck to records. The living corridor held through 4 more runs because people on the moon began doing impossible work, as if impossible work were still a habit from better times. Core mechanics reopened a frozen lift shaft with scavenged heat coils. School volunteers turned a storage hall into a quiet holding area for children waiting on transport. 2 retired miners rebuilt wheel assemblies for shelter carts from old drill parts. Hannah ran triage by lamplight when the ward power dipped. Evo flew the clay meridian with a cracked port shield and complained only when someone mislabeled oxygen bottles as water reserve. The moon began to act like a body that knew where its wounds were. Rhea saw it in small things. People stopped shoving at loading gates when they realized the lists were real. They helped strangers carry blankets because tomorrow's list might carry their own names. In one outer dome, a woman with silver hair who had cursed Earth on the feeds that morning handed a field officer her late husband's thermal coat. Put this on a child, she said, not on someone who already knows how to suffer cold. That was how Earth survived most things, Rhea thought. Not by being clean, by being stubborn enough to keep making society under bad ceilings. The problem was that every success made her more dangerous to the people who had already chosen a different answer. When the southern grid lost pressure in 2 habitats at once, Rhea ordered the clay meridian to to tow a portable filtration spine directly through a debris lane rather than wait for cleared routing. Evo called the maneuver insane and then did it perfectly. The improvised spine locked into place with 3 minutes to spare before reservoir contamination spread. 1,114 civilians kept safe water because a civilian hauler had done something no regulation booklet ever expected. The next Alliance bulletin called the move destabilizing. A commentator on the Core Belt feed said Earth was manufacturing moral theater with human faces to pressure neutral governments. Another asked whether Earth's historical appetite for symbolic sacrifice was once again contaminating sector peace. Rhea read none of it herself. Tomas read it and summarized the useful parts while counting power cells in a storage bay. They are afraid the pictures matter more than their arguments. Good, Rhea said. Then we keep the people alive until the pictures have names. By the second week, sleep became a thing she remembered rather than a thing she did. Once, inside an empty cargo cage crawling between decks, she felt her head drop against the wall and saw with sudden clarity another evacuation from 16 years earlier. Lorne Basin. She had been younger then, not in command, just a junior freight planner on a crater colony where administrators had waited too long to admit a SEAL network was failing. The order to pull had been legal. The corridors had been full. Some people had been told the next lift would come. It had not. Rhea did not think about Lorne Basin often because memory was not usually useful. But that slow mechanical climb through the moon pulled it back. Her mother had died there after giving her rebreather to a boy from the next block. The report had later called the loss unavoidable under system strain. Rhea had read that sentence until language itself felt rotten. On Khepri 9, she was not trying to rewrite the past. She was refusing to cooperate with the same sentence wearing better clothes. The failure that changed the story came on Run 19. The route had been cleared by the same Alliance traffic packet used for earlier medical lifts, a channel Torin had once vouched for. Mercy Bell went first with Hannah aboard because the ward in Shelter Ring 2 had finally reached breaking point. Pine Harbor followed with modular bunks and spare batteries. Halfway through the trench corridor, 3 interceptor craft emerged from a dust band that should have been empty. They did not fire to kill. They fired to herd. One burst forced Mercy Bell high. Another drove Pine Harbor toward a field of spent mining anchors that lit up on radar too late. Rhea heard the calls from operations and knew instantly this was not random pressure. Somebody had known the exact lane and the exact timing. Mercy Bell scraped through with hull damage. Pine Harbor lost maneuvering thrusters and spun into a service ridge hard enough to rupture 2 shelter modules and jam half its internal doors. Rhea was already running when the impact report finished. At the crash site, smoke tasted like burnt copper and insulation foam. Workers and parents crawled over the tilted hull, passing children through a cargo breach. A man with his arm broken in 2 places kept asking whether the bunk modules had survived because his wife was in a shelter without a roof panel. Rhea climbed inside Pine Harbor with a torch and a cutting rig. She found Evo half-pinned under a console and helped drag him clear with 2 deckhands. He stayed awake long enough to grin through blood at the corner of his mouth. Next time, buy a ship built after my childhood. Then he passed out. By the time the wounded were stabilized, the feeds were already saying Earth had attempted an unauthorized breakout under cover of medical traffic and triggered the accident through reckless routing. Someone had not only sold the lane. Someone had prepared the story to match. That was the turn. Rhea still had to keep the rescue moving. But after Pine Harbor, she also had to find the cause before the whole disaster was rewritten over the people who had lived it. She went hunting through data because rage without evidence was only heat. In a half-lit records room carved from old mining offices, she and Tomas pulled transport logs, shield telemetry, Alliance clearances, and cargo manifest chains. Most of the files were dirty from rushed duplication or partial outages. That suited her. Perfect records were easy to curate. Broken ones still had seams. Tomas noticed first that the route authorization metadata on Run 19 had been wrapped through a civilian relief folder not used for 2 cycles. Hannah, exhausted and furious, pointed out that the patient class tags on the medical load had been downgraded after submission. What should have read critical respiratory dependent had become deferred medical transport. Rhea kept digging. At 03 ship time, she found the deeper discrepancy. Khepri Nine sector status code had been revised in a chain no one on the moon had been told about. It had once been listed as a priority civilian rescue zone. Now it sat under a cluster of logistics terms that all meant the same thing in practice. On paper, the moon had been renamed into a place that no longer had to be saved first. Buffer de Tristan sector. Controlled exposure. Delayed humanitarian access, pending strategic stabilization. Rhea read the lines twice, then once more. Her mouth went dry. The meaning was plain. They had changed the words first. Once the words changed, the civilians no longer sat inside the category that demanded urgent rescue. She finally understood why approved corridors had vanished on paper before they vanished in practice. The rescue had not failed by accident. It had been pushed out of the language first. She called Torin on a direct line and made him come down to storage in X9 because she did not trust herself not to put a fist through a screen. He arrived pale, without escort. That was answer enough on its own. Rhea laid the printed code chain on a metal crate between them. Tell me why my civilians stopped existing in your system before anyone bothered to tell the moon. Torin looked at the sheets, and all the small control muscles around his eyes gave out. I did not sign this. You carried their language to me, Rhea said. What do these codes protect? He took too long to answer. A weapons corridor accord, Torin said at last. 3 powers wanted a non-expansion pledge across this sector. The blockade around Khepri Nine was treated as temporary leverage. The assumption was that the population would thin through managed evacuation and incidental loss until the site stopped affecting the map. Incidental loss, Rhea repeated. You mean families? Torin did not defend the phrase. Earth was not told because Earth was expected to resist. If Earth withdrew, the matter could be closed as a regrettable residue of a theater realignment. Rhea stared at him until he took one step back. So the moon became a buffer because powerful people wanted a treaty photo without a rescue bill. He shook his head as if precision still mattered. Not just a treaty. Fleet positioning. Transit guarantees. Market calming. War prevention across 8 systems. At the cost of this one moon. At the cost of place they believed would not be able to speak for itself. The room went silent. Rhea could hear coolant cycling in pipes above them. She understood then that the truth was worse than malice. It was not that specific people had wanted Khepri Nine to die. It was that they had found it acceptable for Khepri Nine to die if something larger became easier to administer. When the code chain finally resolved into something she could place before another mind, Rhea took Tomas to the records wall and showed him every step. He read slowly and carefully, then looked up. They did not mark the moon dead. They marked it less alive each day until nobody had to be the one who killed it. Rhea nodded. That was the shape exactly. Tomas asked what she planned to do with proof that ugly. Use it before they can explain it for us. He leaned against a filing rack and rubbed both hands over his face. You know what happens if we fail now. They did not just say the rescue was reckless. They say the rescue proved the rescue should never have been tried. Rhea looked at the stacks of copied manifests, the hand-logged patient tags, and the shelter maps covered in grease pencil. Then we fail loudly enough that their version cannot fit over ours. Tomas gave a tired, reluctant smile. That is the most human strategy one have ever heard. After Torin left, Rhea sat alone with the code sheets and made the decision that turned the rescue into a case. Saving people was still the first goal. But now she would also save the shape of what had happened, because if the truth vanished, the rescue itself would be buried with it. She ordered full duplication of every cargo manifest, every route request, every medical priority list, every sensor log from the 3 ships, and every record of water distribution and shelter failure. She had Tomas move the copies across 5 physical drives and 3 paper archives because digital truth traveled with too many knives at its back. She told Hannah to log the names and conditions of every patient moved, including those who were not Earth citizens. She told Evo once he came around and insisted on returning to duty against all medical advice to keep flight recorder. Duplicates hidden in the Clay Meridian's waste reclamation housing. You think they will erase it? Evo asked, voice rough. I think they will tidy it, Rhea said. That is what people like this do. They file the dead under words until no one can feel them. From that point on, every outbound run carried more than lives. It carried witnesses, not staged witnesses, not carefully selected mouths. Mechanics, parents, nurses, children old enough to remember the loading queues, technicians who knew which systems had been denied power. Rhea was not building a performance. She was preventing a burial. The moon worsened before it improved. Ridge Battery 1 failed completely during a thermal spike, leaving only a single major defense battery to open departure windows. Shelter Ring 3 had to be consolidated after a ceiling fracture vented half its north corridor. A water pump team went missing in a maintenance cut and was found 6 hours later, sharing one working mask between 4 people. Hannah lost a patient she had kept alive for 3 days because a portable unit stalled during transfer. That death stayed with Rhea because it came after effort, not before. The nurse on shift said only, "We were 3 minutes short," and went back to work with eyes that had gone flat. The living corridor shrank, adapted, held, then shrank again. Yet people still moved. One teacher refused her own place on an early transport until all 12 children in her care had seats. A freight loader named Sun Var pulled 2 broken power sleds by hand through a cooling tunnel because the oxygen cylinders on them were meant for a maternity bay. These moments did not make the crisis noble. They made it human. Rhea stored them the same way she stored logs. Specifics against erasure. The breakout plan grew from scarcity, not daring. By the time she committed to it, Khepri 9 could not survive many more cycles, even with the corridor. The final defense battery had enough charge for 1 concentrated blind and perhaps a second partial pulse. The blockade had tightened after Sarek Valeth realized Earth was not retreating into shame. Rhea studied the old mining routes threading through the moon's debris belts and found a sliver of possibility. Pine Harbor, too damaged to lead, would tow 6 empty shelter shells rigged with heat emitters and false transponders. At the same moment, the Clay Meridian and Mercy Bell would take the real load through a lower trench line masked by vent plumes from the thermal exchange plant. Ridge Battery 2 would fire at the picket cluster, most likely to track large signatures, not the real convoy. It was ugly, fragile, and deeply unlike anything in the manuals. Exactly for that reason, it might work. The real fight came not from design, but from choice. The outbound list was still longer than the available spaces. Rhea refused to let political status, employer, or Earth registry touch the sorting. She stood with Hannah and Tomas for 3 straight hours cutting and recutting the final lifts. Children, critical patients, plant technicians, families nearest imminent failure, then the teams required to maintain launch support for the last ships. At one point, Tomas looked at the remaining list and said very quietly, "There is no just version of this." "Then we do the least dishonest one," Rhea answered. The hardest conversation before the breakout happened away from maps and command screens. It happened in a maintenance chapel that had become a temporary waiting room, where the final launch support crews sat with the knowledge that some of them would remain on Khepri 9 until neutral inspectors arrived. Rhea told them the truth herself. The last lift could not take every technician needed for the long recovery and every vulnerable civilian at the same time. Some healthy adults with the right systems training would stay behind under reduced life support to hold the moon together. No one shouted. That made it worse. A woman named Elsaimar, chief of shelter power routing, asked only one question. "If we stay, do the children leave clean?" "Yes," Rhea said. Elsai nodded and handed over her seat band without ceremony. Others followed. A pump mechanic. 2 thermal plant hands. A freight marshal with a bad knee. Not martyrs. Workers making the kind of bargain history almost never writes down properly. Rhea hated asking it of them. She hated more that the larger system calling itself stable had made such asking necessary. Admiral Sarek called once more before the launch. This time the transmission was private. The fact surprised her. His face appeared on a cracked operations screen, while the room behind her filled with the noise of loading teams. "Commander Soren," Sarek said, "you are about to force a decision I have tried to avoid." Rhea kept checking the departure clock. "You have had weeks to avoid it by letting civilian traffic through." Sarek inclined his head. "You mistake my role. I was never assigned mercy. I was assigned containment." "Then why call?" He was silent long enough that she thought the link had frozen. "Because I have watched your reports," Sarek said at last. "Because I know you believe you're defending something larger than your own flag. And because if you force contact here, your own superiors may find it useful to let you carry the blame alone." The words were not a warning from a friend. They were recognition from an opponent who understood systems. Rhea met his gaze through the screen. "Then they can join the line." Sarek almost smiled, though not with warmth. Humanity's worst habit is making principle difficult to classify. Better than classifying people as acceptable loss. He ended the call himself. The launch window opened under heat haze and prayerless concentration. Ridge Battery 2 fired with a brightness that washed the control glass white. Pine Harbor pushed its decoy shells into the upper lane, each one glowing like a fat transport under false signatures. Picket craft broke toward them almost immediately. At the same instant, Clay Meridian slipped beneath the thermal plumes with Mercy Bell tucked close in its sensor shadow. Rhea rode aboard Mercy Bell because the last medical lift carried too many people who might die if the loading order changed mid-run. She stood strapped near the interior bulkhead while children dozed in crash webbing and adults held them as if pressure itself might try to take them away. Hannah moved from rig to rig, checking tubes and monitors. The ship shuddered once, then again. Someone in the forward hold started praying in a language Rhea did not know. Through the pilot feed, she saw the decoys scattering under fire. Pine Harbor took one hard hit but kept towing, making itself look bigger than it was to keep the lie alive. Then Ridge Battery 2 fired its last full pulse and went dark forever. The lower lane opened. Clay Meridian drove through it like an animal sprinting from a trap. Mercy Bell followed. For 12 impossible minutes, no one spoke except the pilots calling vectors. Then the stars beyond the blockade cleared. A child somewhere behind Rhea began crying. Not in fear, but in the stunned, exhausted way children cry when they realize a bad room has finally opened. Rhea closed her eyes just once. Khepri 9 receded behind them. Not dead and not safe, but emptied enough to survive under emergency custodianship until neutral inspection arrived. Neutral inspection only came because the breakout could not be hidden. Images of Earth's civilian ships emerging with packed holds, medical rigs, and shelter families spread faster than any alliance statement. Some feeds condemned the move as unilateral escalation. Others played it on loop with different captions. The word siege stopped being abstract. The faces did the work. A 9-year-old with a breathing mask waving through a cargo net. A mechanic carrying a sleeping toddler off the Clay Meridian with both hands black from grease. Hannah stepping down the ramp with a stain on her sleeve and a list of names clutched against her chest. Earth did not control the narrative, but it broke the monopoly on it. That was why the hearing came next. The breakout had forced the story into the open, and now the system had to decide whether to punish the rescue or face what the rescue had exposed. 2 cycles later, Galactic Council issued a formal summons. Commander Rhea Soren of Earth was required to appear before a hearing chamber to answer charges of unlawful interference in a regional containment action and misuse of civilian transport assets within a contested zone. The document was majestic in language, sterile in tone, and entirely silent on why more than 40,000 civilians had been left on a moon someone had already decided not to save. The trip to the council seat exposed another fault line inside Earth itself. In a closed briefing, one political observer advised the delegation to separate Earth's moral position from Rhea's personal decision-making. The phrase was smooth enough to survive any news cycle. It also sounded to Rhea like a rehearsal for sacrifice. Mira Dane heard it too and went visibly cold. Mira was Earth's junior legal strategist on the delegation, young, precise, and much harder than her age suggested. After the observer left, she said, if they get nervous, they will keep the amendment and hang the commander. Rhea had known that before boarding. Hearing it aloud only sharpened the edge. If it becomes a choice between my record and the civilians, choose the civilians again, she said. Hannah swore at her. Tomas threatened to resign and file public testimony in the same hour if anyone tried it. Mira simply said, no, we are carrying all of it or none of it. That answer steadied the room in a way strategy never could. By the time they reached council space, they were no longer escorting a witness. They were escorting a story too complete to cleanly amputate. Earth High Command wanted her to travel under council and keep her answers narrow. They provided legal staff, public guidance, and careful advice about what not to say. Do not let them reduce this to emotion, one senior strategist told her aboard the transfer carrier to the council seat. They will be ready for outrage. Rhea almost laughed. The outrage was theirs, not hers. She spent the flight with Tomas, Hannah, and Mira building the case in the only order she trusted. Not principle first, sequence first. Who was where? What failed when? Who depended on which systems? What the order demanded at the moment it was issued? What codes had changed before the withdrawal directive? What routes had been manipulated? What human outcomes sat under each bureaucratic phrase? Mira wanted to build toward a grand accusation. Rhea kept stripping it back. No flerichis. If we are right, the facts already insult them. They organized the rescue by class and then by individual. They prepared sensor chains. They indexed logs against shelter maps. They added testimony only where it anchored a system fact. By the end of the trip, Rhea felt less like a commander heading to judgment and more like a freight officer delivering a load too dangerous to mishandle. The council chamber was everything people imagined and less. It was vast, yes, with layered galleries and polished stone that did not exist on Earth. But once Rhea stood inside it, all she really saw were desks, screens, translation halos, and the worn habits of institutions that believed scale alone gave them dignity. She wore Earth dress blacks because someone above her thought it mattered. To Rhea, the most honest thing in the room was the scar on her hand from a cargo latch on Khepri 9. Counselor Marin Sol chaired the hearing, silver-robed, voice measured, famous for balance in public crises. Around her sat delegates from systems that had never rationed water to a mining shelter in their lives. Earth occupied a lower arc than the primary alliance block. That alone told Rhea enough about how the room saw the matter. The charges were read. She had exceeded theater authority. She had repurposed civilian hulls within a restricted operational perimeter. She had ignored a legitimate withdrawal directive. She had thereby increased the risk of regional confrontation. None of it was false in the narrowest technical sense. That was how the room intended to win. When Marin asked whether Commander Soren understood the charges, Rhea answered that she did. When asked whether she denied acting without authorization after the withdrawal order, she said she did not. A ripple moved through one gallery. Some people mistook plain answers for surrender. Delegate Oren Weiss built the alliance case carefully. He did not call Rhea cruel or reckless. He called her unauthorized. He displayed images of Earth transports moving under partial battery cover. He showed the Pine Harbor crash stripped of the intercept pattern that caused it. He described a regional equilibrium threatened by unilateral moral theater. It was almost elegant. Rhea watched him and understood the shape of the trap. If she defended herself on emotion, he would turn that into proof of impulsive human exceptionalism. If she argued broad ethics too early, he would reduce her to sentiment against process. So when Marin gave her room to answer, Rhea started with the simplest ground truth. She started with what the order meant on the moon. At the time the withdrawal order reached Khepri 9, Rhea said, the southern grid had 11 hours of treated water remaining at civilian minimums. Shelter Ring 2 had 19 pediatric respiratory dependents on powered support. The thermal exchange plant required 8 live technicians on site to prevent cascade failure. No approved humanitarian corridor existed. No neutral transfer fleet existed. No relief authority had taken physical custody of the population. She paused and let the translators catch up. Those are operational conditions. Compliance with the order under those conditions would have terminated life support for people under active Earth protection. If the chamber wishes to call that lawful, it may do so. It should not call it evacuation. That landed harder than any raised voice would have. Vice recovered quickly. He asked whether Earth was entitled to decide that its local judgment superseded collective restraint. Earth was already carrying the bodies your restraint had priced in. Again, there was movement in the chamber. Marin intervened before the room could tilt too far, reminding all delegates that rhetoric would not substitute for evidence. From there, the hearing settled into its real pattern. Vice kept trying to keep the case narrow. He wanted command limits, fleet discipline, and one officer ignoring one order. Rhea kept pulling it back to the same point. What did that order mean for the people still alive on the moon when it arrived? He asked whether civilian flag vessels should ever be modified for movement through contested lanes. She answered by naming what those hulls had been carrying. Water bladders, pediatric rigs, mobile filters, shelter bunks. He asked whether her decision endangered peace. She answered by restating how many civilians were still on the moon when the order arrived. He asked whether she had considered sector stability. Continuing respiration is a stability concern from the ground up. Some delegates found the line sharp enough to resent. Good, Rhea thought. Let them resent gravity. But Vice had his own ammunition. He produced clipped alliance logs showing route deviations, battery cover timing, and advisory flags ignored by Earth. Then he displayed a summary claiming Khepri 9 had already been shifted into a phased civilian reduction program before Earth's noncompliance. That was the dangerous moment. The wording was clean, technical, and designed to sound responsible. The meaning was not. It meant the moon had already been renamed into a place where its civilians no longer counted as an urgent rescue priority. Vice presented it as proof that larger authorities had already assumed responsibility for the site and that Rhea's intervention had disrupted a longer de-escalation plan. That was the part of the hearing half the room wanted to believe. If there had been a plan, then perhaps no one had chosen abandonment. Perhaps the system had merely become complicated. Mira passed Rhea a note with one sentence on it. Make them define reduction. When Marin gave her the floor again, Rhea asked the chamber a simple question. Would the council like the reduction schedule read into record as shelter numbers or as family units? Vice objected, but Marin allowed the question. Rhea brought up the phase program summary and began translating its language into the moon's actual map. Sector decrement 1 meant rings 5 and 6 losing water transport priority. Sector decrement 2 meant deferred oxygen battery replacement in shelter ring 2. Attrition balance threshold meant expected deaths, no longer altered site classification. Transitional non-recoverable population meant people who would remain when approved transport ceased. Silence took the room more effectively than anger had. Now the issue had shifted. This was no longer only about whether she had ignored an order. It was about what the system had been hiding inside its own vocabulary. Vice tried to argue that battlefield planning always required grim categories. Rhea did not deny that. Then say deaths when you mean deaths, she said. Do not say exposure and ask the living to disappear inside your grammar. They brought in witnesses next. The Alliance side chose a regional analyst who spoke in charts about escalation probabilities and likely sector-wide consequences if Earth had challenged the blockade directly with fleet force. Rhea did not object because the analyst clarified what had not happened. Earth had not sent a fleet. Earth had not opened a military campaign. Earth had used 3 transport hulls and 1 remaining battery to move civilians a larger system had already pushed down the list. Then came Torrin Issad. He looked older than he had on the moon, which meant he had decided to tell enough truth to stop sleeping. Under questioning, Torrin admitted that coordination notices to Khepri 9 had been delayed after the site classification changed. He admitted he had warned Commander Soren informally because he feared political handling was overtaking civilian reality. He stopped short of naming the full chain that pushed the code change, but his hesitation itself exposed the shape of pressure. The chamber could smell hierarchy on him. Vice tried to turn Torin into a lone bureaucrat who had panicked and misunderstood routine recoding. Torin said the line that broke that effort. Routine recoding does not happen 2 days before withdrawal demand unless someone wants the paperwork to arrive before the conscience. That line burned through the chamber and the feeds beyond it. Rhea did not look at him. She looked at the bench and saw 3 counselors suddenly writing more than before. The witness who changed the room, however, was not Torin. It was Jalen Mir, a cargo union representative from a minor colony who had been aboard the Clay Meridian during the breakout because his niece needed an oxygen rig. He was not polished. He spoke too bluntly and paused at the wrong times. That made him useful. Vice asked whether Earth had encouraged testimony in exchange for favorable resettlement. Jalen laughed, so hard Marin had to warn him. Earth encouraged me by not leaving my niece to die. Then, in language no one could sanitize, Jalen described what rescue had looked like from inside the ship. Children, stacked near water bladders because there was nowhere else. A nurse reusing her own heat blanket to wrap a stranger's baby. Pilot Evo Mercer refusing pain medicine until the manifest was locked because he wanted the right people on the lift. Jalen said something else too. He remembered seeing one Alliance advisory on the loading wall before the power dipped. It had referred to the site as Khepri Buffer Sector, not Khepri 9. Buffer. Myra's head lifted sharply. She pushed a note to Rhea. The nickname had entered ground traffic before the official summary language surfaced in the hearing. That mattered because it showed the reframing was not a late emergency patch. People above had been calling the moon a buffer long enough for the term to leak downward. Rhea asked leave to submit additional logistics record. Vase objected on timeliness grounds. Marin asked what the record concerned. Terminology. That was enough. The new record came from a freight relay archive Tomas had salvaged and Mira authenticated on the way to the chamber. It linked procurement delay approvals, route priority denials, and status code changes across 3 Alliance offices over 12 days. No single line said abandon the moon. That was not how such things were ever written. What showed instead was sequence. Oxygen replacements delayed because site priority was under review. Water reserve rerouting held pending regional stabilization. Civilian transfer corridor requests deferred until classification finalization. Then the classification itself changed. Then the withdrawal order came. Then public language shifted to de-escalation. A whole machine moving one step at a time so that nobody had to own the full distance. Rhea spoke through it the way she would explain a failed supply chain to a doc team. This is how you kill a place without issuing the sentence in one document. You move need out of view one form at a time. Vice knew then he was losing the clean version of the case, so he went for the Messier truth. He accused Earth of exploiting tragedy after the fact to embarrass rival powers and raise its own standing as protector of frontier populations. The charge had teeth because every state on every world did such things when it could. Rhea did not dodge it. Earth used the truth. That is not the same as creating the truth. Then Vice asked the question he had been saving. Commander Soren, if every local officer on every siege world claimed the right to ignore collective command when personal conscience rebelled, what would remain of interstellar order? The room stilled because the question sounded grand, serious, and partly fair. Rhea looked at him, then at Marin, then out toward the galleries she could not fully see. Perhaps an order that must occasionally explain itself to the people it asks to die. She did not raise her voice. You ask what remains if officers refuse abandonment. I ask what remains if institutions no longer need to say the word. The hearing recessed after that. In the private chamber assigned to Earth, everyone spoke at once until Rhea told them to stop. Hannah wanted the names brought sooner. Mira wanted another chain of procurement authorizations entered before the Alliance could challenge authenticity. Tomas, as always, wanted food and sleep to exist before any strategic plan. Rhea listened, then chose the straightest path. We stop arguing around the dead and bring in the living. Earth's council hesitated because the move was risky. Personal testimony could look theatrical if mishandled. They're already calling us theatrical, Rhea replied. Let them try saying that to a child who still wears a Council Zone tracking band. By the time the chamber reconvened, Earth had secured permission for a limited humanitarian presentation tied strictly to the question of site dependency at the time of withdrawal. Marin allowed it reluctantly, probably believing she could control the impact through procedure. Procedure, Rhea thought, was only ever a leash when the room still believed its own version of dignity. The first name Rhea read into record was not a citizen of Earth. It belonged to a newborn girl from an independent refinery family, born 7 weeks early in Shelter Ring 2. Then came an engineer from a thermal exchange plant who had kept coolant flow stable long enough for 3 transport cycles to launch. Then an elderly teacher from the Outer Dome who had surrendered her seat once and only boarded when the last child in her care was counted. Then a cargo loader from a moon that had voted against Earth in 2 recent trade disputes. Then a miner's widow. Then a boy who had asked whether the badge on Rhea's chest meant the water would last. Each name came with one line: where they were found, what system they depended on, what hour they would likely have died under immediate Earth withdrawal. Mira placed the corresponding manifests and medical logs on the chamber screen one by one. It was not sentimental. That was why it worked. Sentiment invited dismissal. Specificity cornered it. By the 10th name, translators had slowed because some delegates were no longer interrupting to demand procedural narrowing. By the 20th, the galleries had gone utterly quiet. Rhea could feel the room losing the comfortable altitude from which it had hoped to judge her. The people of Khepri 9 were no longer a category. They were consequences with pulses. Then Earth entered the full roster of the rescued. Not every name allowed. That would have taken days, but enough to make the scale tactile. Thousands. Children, technicians, retirees, service workers, patients, people with no strategic importance at all except the importance of existing. Rhea understood, standing there, that this was the true counterstroke the story had promised from the beginning. Not a surprise weapon, not a hidden fleet, an inventory of lives that bureaucracy had already learned to describe as transitional loss. She turned once toward the Alliance benches. These are the people your paperwork expected to become background. They're not background. They're why your categories fail. Vice tried one last time to insist that tragedy did not invalidate the need for chain of command. Rhea agreed. Chain of command matters. That is why someone should answer for changing a rescue zone into a buffer without standing in the same room as the families left there. That answer mattered because it refused the easy myth. She was not saying order itself was the enemy. She was saying order without accountability too. Human reality became a machine for moral outsourcing. Earth's limited humanitarian presentation included one more witness after Jalamir, and this one reached the chamber from a different angle. Hannibal did not come as a speechmaker. She came with treatment logs and the hard posture of a doctor who had run out of patience with political grammar. Hannah described power interruptions in exact minutes, oxygen transfer failures in exact counts, and the number of times she had reused pediatric warming wraps because resupply had been delayed under the downgraded site code. Then Hannah said the sentence that lodged in every summary afterward. I'm a physician. I know the difference between losing a patient and being told to prepare for a category. She held up a ward sheet with the old priority marks and the later downgraded tags side by side. Someone above us changed the meaning of urgency before the children below us stopped needing air. Vice tried to challenge whether medical staff could interpret strategic classification. Hannah answered, I do not interpret strategy. I interpret whether a child turns blue. Even Marin's soul did not interrupt that. The chamber shifted from accusation to self-protection. Counselors who had been content to let Vice drive now began asking their own questions, not because they had grown braver, but because the record had become dangerous. Who authorized the reclassification chain? Why were Earth notifications delayed? Why had neutral inspection not been triggered when civilian dependence remained above threshold? Why did procurement delays align so precisely with the regional weapons corridor talks, now coming to light through unrelated treaty submissions? Pieces started joining in public because once enough truth entered the room, every faction saw a different reason to expose the next layer. Some wanted to wound rivals. Some wanted to protect the institution by sacrificing lower offices. Some, perhaps, were genuinely horrified. Rhea did not care which motive moved them. She only cared that the wall had cracked. Admiral Saravalith was called by remote link as a late witness. He did not crumble. That was not his nature. He said, with frightening honesty, that his blockade orders had assumed the local population would be substantially cleared through alliance-coordinated withdrawal before hard containment took full effect. I was told the humanitarian phase had effectively concluded. The chamber heard what mattered. He had not invented the lie. He had been equipped with it. When asked whether he would have acted differently had he known more than 40,000 civilians remained under active life support dependence, Sarah gave the answer only a disciplined enemy could give. I would have contested the orders I received. It was not redemption. It was verification. The final decision took another cycle of closed deliberation, which the feeds hated and institutions loved. During the wait, Rhea walked an exterior balcony ring of the council complex and looked out at ships hanging silent above the station. Earth officials prepared statements. Journalists hunted comments. Advocacy blocks from frontier colonies flooded the public networks with Khepri 9 testimony. Hannah slept for 10 straight hours in a guest berth, and then woke up angry that no one had woken her sooner. Evo, patched together and still not fit for duty, sent a message that consisted of 2 sentences. If they jail you, I am stealing something expensive. Also tell them my ship is older than their ethics. Rhea laughed aloud for the first time in weeks. Then she went quiet again. She knew what full victory would look like in stories, and she did not expect one. Systems did not like to confess the deepest truth about themselves unless forced far past dignity. The ruling came in public session. Marin Sol read it with the grave tone of someone trying to balance justice, self-preservation, and institutional continuity in real time. The council did not fully exonerate Commander Rhea Soren. It found that she had exceeded formal theater authority in modifying civilian hull use under restricted military conditions. It also found, however, that the alliance coordination structure had failed to disclose material civilian dependence at Khepri 9, that site classification changes had been executed without adequate notification or humanitarian review, and that the charge of Earth deliberately prolonging conflict for nationalist posturing was not supported by the record. The chamber ordered a formal inquiry into the offices involved in the reclassification chain. It suspended several regional containment directives pending review. Most importantly, it adopted an emergency amendment requiring that any civilian rescue zone downgraded during active conflict be subject to transparent review, recorded justification, and direct notification to all on-site relief forces with a right of immediate appeal. It was not poetic. It was better. It was a scar turned into procedure. Earth had not won by being declared pure. Earth had won by making the system write down a limit it had hoped to avoid. Outside the chamber, reactions fractured exactly as they always did. Frontier worlds called it the first time the Council had been forced to treat peripheral lives as more than leverage residue. Alliance loyalists complained the ruling endangered coherent command in future crises. Commentators who had spent weeks calling Earth theatrical suddenly discovered nuance. Vase issued a statement defending regional order while welcoming clarifications in humanitarian protocol. Torin vanished from public view, which probably meant someone had either buried him in paperwork or promoted him sideways into silence. Admiral Saravalith sent no message at all. That, too, was an answer. Rhea gave only one brief comment to the press. The people of Khepri 9 were never a theory. I hope the next chamber remembers that sooner. Then she left before anyone could turn her into a symbol cleaner than the story. Earth offered her honors. Some of them she declined. Some she accepted for the crews, because crews deserve things even when commanders want it quiet. She visited the resettlement wing, where the Khepri evacuees were being processed through longer-term housing and watched ordinary life, trying to return in small, awkward pieces. A boy ran across a corridor without his breathing mask for the first time since the siege. A teacher from the outer dome argued about classroom allotments as if paper cuts had once again become worthy problems. Hannah was teaching a volunteer nurse how to work one of the portable units without swearing at it. Jalamir's niece slept in a warm crib under a ceiling that did not hum with failing seals. The moon had not been saved intact. Too much had broken. Too many had been lost before the corridor ever formed. But the people who had been written toward disappearance were still present enough to cause paperwork on 3 worlds. Rhea found that deeply satisfying. Months after the ruling, when temporary housing had become semi-permanent streets and people had begun planting things in recycled mineral beds just to prove they would be around long enough to watch them grow, Rhea attended a small memorial gathering without cameras. No flags, no speeches. The evacuees from Khepri 9 placed worn tools, cracked shelter tags, and empty filter cartridges around a simple plaque listing the names of those who had not made it to the ships. A child pressed a bent cargo seal into the soil as if it were a seed. Jalamir's niece, healthy enough now to laugh at strangers, tried to steal Tomas's cap and succeeded for almost a minute. Hannah stood with both hands in her coat pockets and looked angrier than sad, which for her meant she was keeping grief in a shape she could carry. Rhea said nothing. She understood the gathering better than any ceremony Earth or the Council could stage. It was the afterlife of accountability. The people who had been almost translated into residue were building memory with their own hands. No chamber could improve on that. Weeks later, during the first full review session on the new Transparency Amendment, a counselor from a system that had voted against Earth asked whether the Khepri provisions were not an overcorrection driven by one especially public case. Marin Sol, perhaps surprising herself, answered that institutions were rarely accused of overcorrecting when their mistakes had benefited the center. The remark spread almost as quickly as the breakout images had. Khepri 9 was no longer just a moon. It had become a question people could use on power. When officials said stability, others now asked for the dependency figures. When commanders said acceptable losses, labor unions demanded to know acceptable to whom. When site codes changed in conflict zones, local officers suddenly filed appeals with a confidence they had not possessed before. The galaxy had not transformed into kindness. That would have been fantasy. It had merely lost one layer of elegant concealment. Sometimes that was how history moved, not by making the strong better, by taking away one of the masks they preferred. Rhea returned once to the orbit above Khepri 9 as part of a neutral restoration convoy. The moon still bore its wounds openly. Whole arcs of the outer shell remained dark. Ridge Battery 2 sat cracked and silent where it had spent its last charge buying a road out for ships too humble to make history on anyone's planning board. She visited Water Hub 3, now quiet, the line gone, the purifier bank rebuilt. Someone had scratched a sentence into one of the replaced filter housings. Not a slogan, not a patriotic line. Just words from a place that had learned how near it had come to vanishing. We were here. Rhea ran her fingers over the groove and thought that perhaps this was what all her work had really been for. Not vindication. Evidence of existence sturdy enough to survive contact with power. On the return shuttle, a junior officer asked whether she regretted disobeying the withdrawal order, knowing it had nearly ended her career and might yet shape the rest of it. Rhea looked through the viewport at the moon, shrinking behind them. I regret that the order was written. Disobeying it was just accounting. Years later, analysts would still debate Khepri 9 in seminars, command schools, treaty revisions, and angry network panels. Some would call it the case that preserved humanity's moral standing during a dangerous realignment. Others would call it the beginning of a more disorderly era in which local commanders became harder to manage. Both readings missed the center. The center was smaller. It was a room on a siege moon where a line of civilians waited with water canisters. It was 3 cargo ships that had no business carrying the weight of a political civilization. It was a commander who understood that logistics was not the shadow of war. It was the place where society decided what its words were worth. Galaxy Council learned many things from Khepri 9, or claimed to. Earth learned one thing it had known before and now knew in public. Humanity was hardest to crush not when it looked strongest, but when it refused to help power make the abandoned disappear. By the time new crises rose elsewhere, people had started using a phrase no alliance office had ever intended to create. Do not make another Khepri. It appeared in union petitions, rescue dispatches, relief training, and frontline briefings. It annoyed the powerful because it condensed too much judgment into too few words. That was precisely why it lasted. Somewhere in the Council archives, the official case title remained long, balanced, and decorous. Commander Rhea Soren versus Regional Containment Authority. In the mouths of people who hauled cargo, fixed pumps, counted bodies, and watched institutions name things from far away, the story was simpler. Earth refused to abandon the siege moon. That was all. That was enough. And from that day on, whenever the galaxy tried to dress organized cowardice in the clean language of restraint, there was always someone ready to ask the question Khepri Nine had forced into the open. Stability for whom? Peace for whom? And who, this time, was being asked to die quietly so the map could keep pretending it was clean? Before we go, hold on to this for a moment. In a galaxy full of laws, fleets, and polished words, what mattered most was not who sounded wiser in the chamber. It was who refused to leave innocent people behind when leaving them behind was the easier choice. Rhea Soren did not stand for glory. She did not stand for applause. She stood because 40,000 lives were about to be turned into a strategic footnote, and Earth refused to let that happen. That is what made the difference. Not power alone. Not anger alone, but the stubborn, costly, deeply human choice to remember that every life still counts, even when a larger system says it does not. And maybe that is why humanity is so hard to crush, because even when the odds are terrible, even when the rules are written by someone else, there are still people who will stand their ground and say, no, not this time. Not these people. Not while we are still here. If this story stayed with you, please like the video, share it with someone who loves powerful science fiction stories, and subscribe to the channel for more stories where humanity is tested, pushed to the edge, and still refuses to disappear. Thank you for listening. Until the next story, take care of yourself, and never forget what courage looks like when it chooses to protect, not just to win.